Hi, welcome to another JAVAWUG presentation. On Wednesday the 22nd of September 2006, Jason Van Zyl delivered an absolutely brilliant, positively brilliant talk to the Java Web's users group about Apache Maven 2. This presentation covers the key concepts, starting with a rapido introduction to the philosophy of Maven and why it was designed to follow the concept of build by convention. Jason explained the practical disadvantages of why building with Ant in large projects is a major headache for software developers around the world. Why should you always be generating the same Java compiler target in every new project? It's far better to hand over project management to a dedicated tool. This presentation took place at Sun Microsystem's London Customer Briefing Centre in London Bridge. I'd like to specially thank Michael Lonnan for his special support on the evening. My name is Peter Pilgrim. Enjoy this one especially from me.
I call it our presentation, Maven, the Beautiful City, and we'll go through how I relate Maven, like in development infrastructures, to healthy cities. The city that I use for my comparison all the time is Portland, Oregon, which is a city in North America on the West Coast. So essentially trying to draw analogies between how a healthy city infrastructure and how that infrastructure is made viable and how to actually make a development infrastructure viable. So I had the good fortune that both my parents were city planners, so I've learned about cities and infrastructures and the value of infrastructure my whole life. As I got older, I finally sort of realized I actually knew what they were talking about and actually used some of the ideas they were talking about my whole life. Sort of, it's applied to Maven. So, I mean, most people here, you said you've all been using Maven, so I mean, you know all this stuff already. We'll just try and get through this and maybe do some more demos. But you know, a build tool, dependency management tool. Are people using the site generation, and do they use everything with it? No? No? Okay, well, you can actually generate some pretty comprehensive sites and all the reporting that's built into Maven. So it works well as a build tool and a dependency management tool, but you can also generate sites, which are actually important for communicating information, which we'll get to in a second. So as I was saying, like trying to compare city infrastructures to development infrastructures, that might be how you're building, how you're testing, where you put your documentation, how you generate your documentation, how you do your continuous integration, how you're doing releases, and how you're doing provisioning, which is, there's a new tool that's coming out in the Maven project. Are people familiar with any of the other projects that are at Maven? There's Maven itself, the build tool, which is probably what people are most familiar with. There's Continuum, which is the continuous integration tool. Maven SCM, which is an abstraction for all SCM. So Continuum uses it, the release plugin uses it. And that's taken off of late, so we have, CVS supports the version, Perforce, ClearCase, StarTeam, Git, which is the one that Linux currently uses, one called Bazaar, which I've never heard of in my life, and a whole bunch of other ones. People are just adding them. They're basically just pluggable providers. So if you want to use Continuum properly, or if you want to use the release plugin, you need an SCM provider. So lots of people have started actually providing and helping with those, so that they can actually take advantage of Continuum and doing releasing. Provisioning is coming from another related project at Apache, and by provisioning, we have a project called Feynman, which is named after the physicist Richard Feynman, to sort of give a grand unified theory of development infrastructure. So the goal of that project is being able to take a machine from bare metal and bring it up and have Subversion, Continuum, something like Jira, Confluence, everything that you need for development to have in a recipe like you do with a POM, if you're familiar with Maven, sort of the analogy of having a recipe for your project. This would be basically a recipe for your entire build infrastructure. So you could basically regenerate everything you need to do your builds, documentation, everything. I have a little presentation on it later. It's something that I've been working on with a couple clients and some people like Patrick Lightbody, who does he's the author of WebWork. I guess he's moved now to the Struts framework. We can talk a bit about that later. That's what's actually quite exciting. I'm actually really interested in getting that project up there. So that's what build infrastructures consist of. Pretty much everything you need to actually have a healthy build environment. So of late, there have been a couple. I'll publish the slides to these. These actual, to look these up, are actually pretty interesting. I always like to ask people what are the biggest problems they've had with Maven. Anybody had problems trying to find dependencies at Idiblio? Things that aren't in Idiblio? Yeah, that's a common problem. If people had problems with Idiblio in general, do you manage your own repositories, or do you actually does one person download things from Idiblio and make your own internal repository? Yeah, there's the one thing that I did about 2 weeks ago is that the central repository is no longer at Idiblio, which was a public service hosted by the University of North Carolina. They keep an archive of all the Linux distributions, dictionaries, books, and that's where the central repository was, and it was just getting killed midday U.S. time. It was pretty much impossible. So a lot of the actual complaints deal with the central repository and those blogs. There's lots of other things in there as well, but the central repository is now on a dedicated machine that sits on top of 3 T3s, and the only thing on the box is the central repository, and it's monitored 24/7. So people shouldn't be having any more problems with the central repository. So that's now the company that does it is Contigix, and they're in St. Louis, and for a few banner ads, they pretty much pay for the entire infrastructure. So that's one of the huge improvements that's been done. Anybody had any other big problems that come to mind? A lot of people have had problems with things like Spring dependencies or Hibernate dependencies.
That's the biggest one.
Yeah, and those are, there's been some blog entries lately. It's the Jira issue that has the most number of votes in the Spring Jira, and they didn't want to, we've done the conversion for them, it's in the book. They didn't want to switch over to Maven while they were going from their 1.0 to the 2.0 releases. So hopefully that's something that once they start building with Maven, then those problems should be resolved as well. So a lot of the problems people have with Maven are either the central repository, which has been fixed, but a larger problem is the metadata in general. That's hard to resolve. If projects don't actually build with Maven, then the POM is just a useless piece of information that is really they do it to try and keep their users happy. So the Spring people have manually kept their POMs up to date to try and help Spring users, but it doesn't work unless you're building with it, because it just gets out of date. The second after you change a dependency, everything breaks for people who need the Spring POM. Trying to think of any of the other problems. Usually it has to do with metadata or the repository. Anybody have any complaints with the sites, like the stuff that's generated, or any plugin dependencies they've had problems with?
The Eclipse plugin, we have a few problems.
Yeah, the Eclipse. The Eclipse, the one that you actually embed in Maven, or the one from the command line?
The one you embed in Eclipse.
Right.
So,
which version? The latest one, which is 0.9?
Yes, yeah, that's it.
Because the latest one Maven's actually done quite a bit of work on, and when I toured around Europe the last time, most people were pretty happy with it. What's
what we're finding is we can, where we have, say, a web app artifact, that will build fine, but a jar file won't. Whereas from the command line, you're absolutely fine. So there's something in there that's just not quite. From the same POMs, it's not quite consistent.
A lot of, do you use WTP?
Yes.
Yeah, there's some problems with the Eclipse. I don't actually use Eclipse, so I can't really comment on it. I've used it to try and do demos, but I don't actually develop Eclipse, so it's stuff for me too. Generally, the Ide integration is probably going to improve. I've hired someone to do IntelliJ integration. There's already someone who's paid doing the Eclipse integration, and an employee at NetBeans is actually working on the NetBeans. The NetBeans integration is probably the best so far, even if I pay someone to do the Eclipse integration. The NetBeans integration is better.
Just out of interest, what do you use?
I use IntelliJ.
Okay.
I was a long time Linux user, and nothing else really worked. Like NetBeans was too slow. I couldn't even get Eclipse to run because it was using Motif at the time. And IntelliJ was really the only thing. The test was that it'd be useful in under 10 minutes and I could actually do something with IntelliJ. So that's what I stuck with, and that's what I've stayed with. So I talked briefly. I'm going to publish the slide, so I'll move through these. But basically, the central idea with Maven that I've tried to draw an analogy to with the cities is basically an intentional infrastructure. That's probably the most important thing there. Is really if you're going to have an infrastructure that works for you, you have to invest a little time in it. You have to invest a little money, and it takes some planning. It's not just going to spring up by itself. And if you don't, it will almost always 100% of the time fall apart when you actually need it the most, which is when you need to do a release or when you need to train people. Whenever it's in a high degree of flux, that's generally when it will not work for you. So some of the questions I asked, I've done some work for, I think I'm technically allowed to talk about E-Trade, but I've done some work for E-Trade and some other, really large organizations in the U.S. And a lot of them are deciding that they want to leverage open source tools. They'll use things like Tomcat or Jetty, and they want to use Maven, and they talk about it. And really, the question comes up is, if you've developed your own in-house build system, is it really a competitive advantage? And I would say probably 100% of the time it's no. So if you've actually developed your own build tool and build infrastructure, the question I would ask is, if you're developing J2E applications and using other best, standard practices, and would you try and redo an application server, or would you try and use something other than JMS? And there again, the question is probably no. So if you can actually leverage some patterns and practices that people are using for build infrastructures, then it's generally going to save you time. And some of the companies that I've worked for have very extensive build systems that they've developed, and created extensions for things like ClearCase, and I've invested quite a bit of time, but with a little bit of analysis, it usually, and there are definitely the clear cases where you have, one or two people in your whole organization that know how the actual build system works or where everything is. And if those people happen to vanish, you'd be dead. And not so severe cases, even where there are people around to do it. People often get bored of trying to take care of the infrastructure, and people who may initially be excited at trying to fix your infrastructure and get all the builds working rapidly lose interest in it. So, one of the advantages of Maven is that things are set up in a similar way. So if you have to bring in new people in your organization, or new people are going to come on board to take care of your builds or to publish your documentation or do releases, then the likelihood that you'll find someone who can actually do it is far greater if you're using something that everybody else is using to create builds and do releases. And really it boils down to, do you want help with the most difficult infrastructural problems you have? One of the biggest problems at places like Apache or Codehouse, I've been at Apache for 7 years, and I can probably find maybe a couple dozen builds that will actually build off one of the tags. Something that's supposed to be a release is essentially unreproducible. So, things like Continuum and Maven's release plugin try and help you do continuous integration easier, and to try and help you produce releases that will actually work. And of course they have bugs like everything else, but they go a long way to helping with problems of doing correct releases and doing continuous integration properly. So again, the infrastructure should supply some inherent utility, so trying to get new developers up to speed, trying to get projects going quickly. One of the demos I'll do is of the Archetype system later on. But essentially with having an infrastructure that's being shared by everybody else, there's a good chance that somebody else has come along with the same problem that you have or solved the problem that you've already encountered. And you can either talk to people in your own organization, or you can talk to people in the Maven community. There's generally probably 95% of all the questions on the user list have already been answered in one form or another. People who were at my last presentation, you're going to hear the same thing again, but essentially everybody working together and having the same patterns being used over and over is something that's referred to as social capital, or how large groups of people, how well they work together. The one example I have is the metadata problem with Spring, and they are converting all their projects slowly but surely. So the web services project uses Maven 2, the rich client framework uses Maven 2, a CG uses Maven 2, and they're slowly starting to switch over to the core build. So metadata problems that were exposed and users complaining and users voting in Jira are actually affecting some form of change. Like projects are actually changing and starting to build with Maven as a result of users asking for it. So those are the sorts of things that are happening. If there weren't so many people building with Maven and everybody was using Ant, the chances that you could actually get the interface 21 people to make a change is probably pretty close to zero. But because so many people are trying to build, Spring applications with Maven, there's a large base of people to actually make them change. So I talked about it. Standards and best practices. Provide a shared language for build infrastructures, very much along the lines of the design patterns book that people use for developing applications, and they all come from the ideas of Christopher Alexander, the guy who wrote a pattern language and a timeless way of building. Basically patterns for healthy environments, whether they be for cities or whether it's for a development infrastructure. So people who are familiar with Maven, I guess there's some people coming in. Is there anyone here, you haven't used Maven? Is there anybody here who hasn't used Maven? So we have a few people. Okay, so we'll run through that. So the main principles of Maven are sort of model-driven development, convention over configuration, the reuse and encapsulation of build logic, and coherent organization of dependencies. So everything in Maven is driven around what's called the POM, or the project object model. So that's essentially what a minimal POM looks like. Everything in Maven revolves around a file that looks similar to that. Inside a POM is pretty much a description of everything you might use for building your project and for describing your project. So it lists your, you can see there, developers, any dependencies that you need to actually build your project, plugins that you might use on your project, the type of reporting you have, so they could be quality reports like check style, your coverage. Plugins you might use could range from anything from generating, building EJBs, or plugins to generate sources from grammars like Antler or JavaCC. Distribution management, so that's specifically where you actually place the jars that you build and where you actually would generate your sites that people would actually look at, where they would find all your reports and all the information about your project. Source control, so you would actually have a description of where your sources are, so whether it be Subversion or ClearCase or CVS. It also has a description of your continuous integration setup. So you might be describing something like cruise control or your Continuum setup or Anthill or any of the other tools. The issue management system, so where you can actually find out about the issues that are pending on your project. All that information is stored in a POM. So that's a very short version of a POM, and this is implicit here is inheritance in Maven. So this little file here can actually do a lot. So people who are not familiar with Maven, with that simple file there, you can actually compile your sources, run your tests, install artifacts in a local repository, generate a minimal site, generate resources if you need to, package up resources in your jar. So everything is, all the defaults that are used in Maven are actually inherited from something called the super POM. So just as in Java, you have the implicit parent of every object is JavaLang object. In Maven, the implicit parent of every POM is the super POM. So, and the POM contains a lot of the default information in Maven, so a lot of the conventions that are used. So, so some of the conventions that we use are standard directory layouts, the idea that you have one primary artifact per build, so usually that's one jar for one project. It's trying to encourage separation of concerns, and standard naming conventions. So all of those conventions are encapsulated in the super POM so that you don't actually have to declare them over and over again. So if you use the conventions in Maven, you can actually get, this is a totally functional POM, and you can actually do quite a bit with that. Oftentimes for your organization, you might have your own organizational POM, which might have some of your standards in it, like your repository setup, your distribution management. So you leverage the super POM, and then maybe have some organizational information a level below it. But for the most part, your POMs can be that size, barring the dependencies that you might need for your project. So you might have way more dependencies, but generally, POM essentially looks like that. Can look like that. So the other model that we have in Maven is what's called the standard build lifecycle. So if people who are familiar with Ant and calling certain tasks all over the place, generally if you look at an Ant build file and you look at another Ant build file, generally they're never the same. I haven't really found two that are quite the same, even when people are trying to use the import task and things like that. And in Maven 1 we had the idea of goals, and the sort of execution path to be rather arbitrary. One of the biggest changes between Maven 1 and Maven 2 is the standard build lifecycle. So the standard build lifecycle extracts information from the POM and passes through these stages. This is an abbreviated form of it. There's actually a lot more phases in between. But all these phases are passed through. So the compile phase by default will invoke the JavaC compiler. Testing will by default invoke the Surefire plugin, which can execute JUnit tests. Packaging is generally either maybe packaging up a jar file, packaging up a war file, packaging up a near file. Installing into your local repository, and deploying. So if you become familiar with, on one project, the way this lifecycle works, it works the same for any other project in Maven, regardless of what you're producing. It passes through the standard build lifecycle, regardless of whether you're making a war file, a jar file, or an ear file. And the way you actually augment your build in Maven is still through the standard build lifecycle. But if you need to add functionality to your build, so if you need to, say, use the Antler plugin to generate some Java sources, you would actually plug into the generate sources phase. Or if you wanted to generate resources, say, using xDoclet to look at your Java sources, or grabbing information from annotations, you would plug into the generate resources phase. If you wanted to change what you were compiling, this standard default lifecycle works. Its default mode is with Java. But I'm actually building C projects, and people use Maven for .NET projects as well. So you can actually change the compiler out in the compile phase and use the .NET compiler, or you can use a C compiler if you're building C projects. I've done it. I've used it to actually make RPMs. So yes, it's not just for Java. I've done large projects building C++ and a mix of Perl, actually. So again, the POM, the standard build lifecycle, and that model is probably the biggest improvement, those two things, between Maven 1 and Maven 2, and sort of a standardization of the execution path of a build, I think is one of the greatest advantages over something like Ant. So I talked about that briefly before, convention over configuration, which is something that's been popularized by Ruby on Rails, but it's something that's always existed in Maven in terms of where you find your application sources, where you find your test sources, where you find your documentation. All those things are in a standard place in Maven, so that once somebody is familiar with the Maven project, they know how to find the content of a project on any Maven project. The encapsulation and reuse of build logic. So again, to augment the build in Maven, it's all done with plugins plugging into the default lifecycle. So Maven is really a plugin execution framework. It follows that lifecycle, and there's rules for decorating the lifecycle and injecting things into the lifecycle, and it has a very standard way of doing that. So a lot of times people ask, well, what's the difference between an Ant task and a Maven plugin? So the one that I usually use as an example is the Ant Java-C task and the Maven compiler plugin. So Ant is a great toolbox, and in Maven 2 we've gone through a lot more effort to actually make Ant reusable in Maven. So it was quite painful in Maven 1, but you can actually write Maven 2 plugins using Ant script if you want. The default, most people write their plugins in Java, but the WebSphere plugin we actually have uses Ant scripts. But back to the example, the comparison between the Maven compiler plugin and the Java-C task. So if you look at how the Java-C task is used in any of the Ant build files you have, there's usually more than one way to configure it. But you always have to tell it where your sources are, how you're going to create your class path, any other resources you need, where the output directory is going to be. Whereas with the Maven compiler plugin, people who write plugins, it's usually the plugin author's responsibility to try and make something that works in a standard way with Maven. So the compiler plugin is no exception. So the applications come from the standard place in Maven. The class path is built in a very specific way from you, from the dependencies in your project. And there's a standard place where the output goes. So the plugin itself is part of the default lifecycle and can get all the configuration that it needs from the defaults in Maven. So if you actually look at the POM, this POM will actually compile any of your application sources, but there's no configuration for it. It just works by default. So the Maven compiler plugin actually is a tool, just like Ant, but it carries with it a lot of process patterns and some structure with it. So people who write Maven plugins will usually have some built-in defaults, which means that most Maven plugins, or a lot of them, can actually be zero configuration. There's no way to get around something like the Antler plugin where you actually have to specify your parameter files that you want to use. You can't have zero configuration in it. But for many of the plugins where there are standard locations for resources and sources and documentation, plugins have a pattern built into them so that they're either zero configuration or very minimal configuration. So that's the difference. I like a toolbox versus a toolbox with some encapsulated structure and patterns. The way dependencies work in Maven. People who have used Maven are familiar with the way it downloads any of the dependencies you need and places them in your local repository. If we look at this POM here, you'll see that inside the dependency section here, there is a dependency on JUnit. So you'll notice here, to actually get a build like this to work, Maven knows how to find JUnit and knows how to use it with your tests. So what Maven is actually doing is it looks at the dependencies that you have, and it actually looks in a default place, which is the Maven central repository, and it actually tries to retrieve that dependency from a remote repository. So everything in Maven works from your local repository. So Maven will always examine your dependencies that you specify. See if they're present in your local repository. If they're not, Maven will fetch everything for you that you need for your project. To build your project, any of the dependencies that your plugins have will also be downloaded. And they're all placed in your local repository. And once they're in your local repository, that's where Maven works from. So it's a very declarative way of saying what your dependencies are. Basically, you're giving it the minimal information. Every dependency in Maven has a group ID, an artifact ID, and a version. And that's how Maven actually finds what you're looking for. It can be from default repository or any external repositories that you define. And you'll notice there's a scope element here. Scopes on dependencies are what Maven uses to, it's hinting information as how to build your class path. So here, JUnit is obviously, most people are familiar with it, and it's used for testing, but if you're packaging up a war file, you obviously, for the most part, don't want JUnit packaged up with your war. So Maven knows by looking at the scope that it's used for testing, and will actually exclude it from packaging in an ear file or a war file. Some other scopes that we have are a provided scope, so people who develop with application servers, a lot of times you need to specify as dependencies artifacts that your application server provides. So you would mark that as provided so that your project could actually build, but when you actually created war files or ear files, a scope of provided means that it's going to be provided for you at runtime, so not to package it up. So that's how dependencies are used in Maven. So everything is done declaratively, and there are several advantages of doing this. One is not so much from a resource perspective. Disk space is cheap, but still, it means that one copy of JUnit will be used for 1,000 projects. You declare that you need JUnit, and only one copy of it is stored on your machine. The most important advantage of actually declaring your dependencies in this way means that you can actually have some form of dependency analysis. So in large Maven projects that consist of several modules, there are often times where you could have dependency conflicts, where you might have multiple versions of log4j, or you're trying to make sure that what you're actually building will deploy at runtime. So declaring your dependencies like this means that Maven can actually get hold of enough information to actually do some dependency analysis. If you have, say for example, an Ant, a big lib directory of jar files, Ant has no idea what those are, it just aggregates them together and builds a class path for you. As your project grows, if you have other projects that are building other artifacts that get combined together, really it's something that you manually have to keep track of. And if you do have dependency conflicts, either you're going to get artifacts that are packaged up with multiple versions of the same artifact, and trying to do any sort of analysis is completely manual. So things that people are working on are, dependency graphing systems, so that you can look at a whole project and visually see which dependencies are available and which ones conflict.
Is that a report?
Yes, there actually is a dependency convergence report if you actually want to see all the dependencies that are used in a, if you have what's called a multi-module build, if you have several modules, if you're building small components, the dependency convergence report will look over all those modules and tell you if you have conflicting versions of specific artifacts. So that's the first step, and it's a fairly primitive report. We don't actually have any active way in any of the Ide integration right now to see that you have conflicts, and maybe try and something in the future where you might sort of optimize your dependencies in an IDE and say that, I see there's 4 versions of commons logging. I would like to pick this one, and then it edits all your POMs or moves that common version of the dependency up to the top level. That's sort of the POM editing that we're sort of looking for in the IDEs in the future. That sort of tooling is only possible in a declarative way with dependencies. There's no way you could ever sort of do that with Ant, where you don't specify any metadata or information about your dependencies. Any form of dependency analysis is impossible. Unless you want to go scraping through the class files. People can do it, but it's extremely painful trying to either walk through with B-cell or ASM and try and figure it out yourself. You may as well just say what it is up front, and you actually get the benefit of being able to use that information.
I was skipping through the debug output of the Maven build, trying to work out where the actual debug output indents the dependency one up to the other.
And that's still pretty rough to read. I would still, the NetBeans plugin probably has the NetBeans plugin can actually graph the dependencies. So it is the only IDE right now that actually will give you a visual picture of your dependency tree. So we're trying to, that will probably come next in the IntelliJ plugin, and as far as Eclipse, I have no idea what they'll use for that. I don't know what the graphing framework is in Eclipse. So that's how dependencies work in Maven. So we pretty much talked about all these. So coherence, it basically means that all the parts are organized in a certain way, and it all boils down to becoming familiar with the way a Maven project works and having other people know how a Maven project works. Reusing not only components from other projects, like making it very easy to add a dependency and pulling down something new to try it, but being able to use some of the patterns that are built into Maven by default. The best example is testing being run before you can actually package anything up. So you can turn off testing if you want before you package something up, but it's cumbersome. By default, Maven always wants to run the test before you're actually going to package something up or try and deploy it. So those sorts of best practices are sort of built into Maven, and the first time a developer tries to use a Maven project, they'll see that the tests actually run. Whereas somebody who's probably building an Ant script for the first time, adding the JUnit task is an afterthought. They'll do it after they actually get everything else working. Someone builds a Maven project for the first time, even with that very minimal POM, the test will be attempted, even if there are no tests. But the default archetype, which is a project template that usually beginners of Maven generate for the first time, has a simple application source and a simple test source. So the very first time people use Maven, they generally see the test run. It's just a pattern that's built into Maven, or just a convention that's built into Maven. Oh, sorry. Agility, again, it means that people can move between projects, they know how things work. So bringing new people on or sharing people between projects is a lot easier when they can actually get into the job of working on the application and not figuring out how the build actually works. I've been in a lot of places where, half and half, sometimes the developers, the build is usually maintained by someone who's fully responsible for the build. And they actually use continuous integration systems to figure out whether it works or not. I've been in places where the build is so large that developers don't actually build things themselves. People work in places like that, but I've seen a few of them. But when developers actually are responsible for building things themselves and testing it, it's a lot easier for people to use a Maven project. And maintainability. Again, it's just something that's a byproduct of things being the same and things being declarative. It's usually much simpler. Top-level POM files can definitely get very large. I'm looking at projects like Geronimo. I mean, the top-level parent POM is quite large, but it's still maintainable from the point of view of creating new modules and starting new projects and inheriting from the top-level POM. And bringing along with it all the conventions that Geronimo uses. Trying to start a new module in Geronimo is pretty easy. Is anybody, people that are using Maven 2 here, did they start new projects with Maven 2 or did they actually try and convert existing projects? I just checked in a new tool today called Metamorphosis, which actually attempts at converting non-Maven projects to Maven projects. So if anybody's interested, I can show you later on, but I used it the other day to convert some WebSphere projects that were in, some of them were in Ant, some of them were in Maven 1, and some of them had shell scripts. Trying to move something arbitrary into a patterned way was actually relatively easy now that we have, I don't know if anybody's heard of the Maven Repository Manager. It's recently been renamed Archetype, but it's an application that runs on the central repository now, and it indexes everything. It indexes all the POM files, indexes all the MD5 checksums, any of the information in the POM. If we have a network connection, I can actually show you it running. But I can do these conversions now because I have MD5 checksums of all the open source artifacts, and I can run the indexer on anybody's internal repository. So what Metamorphosis will do is you have to give it some hinting information about where your jar file directories are, if you have a directory of jars, or where your sources are, test sources and resources. It needs some information, but it will actually take MD5 checksums of a big, huge directory of jars, and then it calls the repository manager to look up what those artifacts are. So they can be nothing. It can say, commons logging.jar, But with the MD5 checksum, I can actually figure out whether it's cons logging 1.1 or 2 or whatever it is, and it will attempt to make a functioning POM. So it will do about 85–90% of the work of actually converting any project structure over to a Maven project structure, with an option to move it over to something that's Maven compliant, where you end up with a POM like you saw earlier, or whether you want to keep the existing structure and create the mapping in POM, which ends up being a lot bigger. But the project that I was working on the other day had 5 branches, so if you change the directory structure entirely, it's almost impossible to do merges between those branches. So in a lot of cases with projects that are converting, you can't use a lot of the Maven standards because it just makes working with groups of people and branches, it's too hard to merge. You can't do it. Or generally it's too hard. So, just trying to make things easier, trying to relieve the burden of trying to come up with everything yourself, just like you'd use J2E or other patterns. You don't want to do it all over again. It's the build infrastructure. It's interesting getting it all working, but it is. It's better to have it working, and it can be quite tedious and boring. It's an interesting problem trying to get it to work, but I originally wrote Maven because I actually like developing applications. I don't really like. I wrote it because I couldn't actually get anything to build, but I wanted the things to build so I could actually do some work. Anybody who's using Maven 2, has anybody used Archetypes? Sort of? No? Okay, so I'll do I was going to show Archetypes, and I was going to show Continuum, and if anybody knows of anything else, I'm not sure if there's a network connection around here, but I can show you the... No, it doesn't look like it. So I'm just going to run a couple archetype commands. The normal Maven command giving a project a group ID and artifact ID. I'm going to generate a site on top of it. So other than the default, you have to specify the actual archetype that you want to use. But essentially, archetypes it's just another Maven artifact. So it's basically a jar file with velocity templates inside it. So if anybody's familiar with Velocity, the little templating tool, you can actually put Java source files or resources inside a template or inside an archetype. And I'll just demonstrate here. So that generated a directory structure. Let's see how big the tree is here. So from those 2 archetypes, it spit out a little small application, and it spit out a little site that you can use, and one simple test. So if we run everything to the install phase in Maven, it'll pass through the lifecycle, through compiling, testing. So compiling, packaging everything up. So if you package things up in archetypes, that's essentially how long it can take to get something up and running. So I had the archetypes local on my machine, but that's pretty much how fast you can get something up and running. I also generated a site archetype over top of the project that I generated. So we have a simple wiki-like format called apt for generating documentation. We have a simple fact format that we use for creating facts. Internationalization, so the site in French. the little site descriptor that's used for creating simple menus and links across the standard Maven site. So,
I've looked at some of the archetype stuff and I just haven't had time to do it. Is it easy to create your own directory paths yet?
No. So
okay.
There's not the tool that I've started that isn't finished is something to actually take an existing project and turn it into an archetype. It doesn't work 100%. It works in many cases, but it doesn't work all the time right now. People can. I actually have to hook up Antler and have a little Java parser to figure out all the stuff that would need to be done to get it to work properly all the time. But essentially, the goal is to have a fully functioning project and be able to run it in Continuum, test it, update it, turn it into an archetype, deploy it. Right now, you have to manually specify. If you've tried to make an archetype, it can be tedious to try and keep it up to date, but actually add things to it, test it, turn it back into an archetype. So the tool that we're trying to create should allow you to make it work as a normal project and work like any other project and make it a lot easier to maintain them. Right now, the maintenance is a problem. Making one at first is not so hard, but actually trying to modify it and test it is a pain in the ass.
Right. Have you got a name for the tool? What's the name of the tool?
Archetype, but it's the Archetype plugin, but it's a goal just create from project. So
okay.
Archetype create from project.
One of the main things that you'd want to put into an archetype above and beyond things like website or PDF file or
you might want to encapsulate any resources or stub tests that you might have. You might have a web service, so you might include a standard stub test for a web service. You might have certain dependencies in your organization that you want to use for your web services, so you could create a column with all the dependencies you need, a stub test, a little example, an example web service, an example test, everything that you need to actually try and get someone up and running and started. So it could be anything you might have. It might be for a stub, it might be for an EJB, it might be for a web service. It really can be any Maven project that you might want to make easy for someone to do. So you can really package up anything you want in Archetype. It's rather arbitrary. We have some standard archetypes, but the Struts project uses archetypes for all their examples. So they have, for all the examples they have on their website, they have an archetype, so people can read through their documents, see what they're trying to explain, how certain actions work, or how you hook up certain JSPs or whatever. So they have archetypes for each one of their examples. So generally it's used to get new developers up and running, or a lot of times people use them for training.
I believe Activemq 2 is
switching over to Maven 2, and so they'll have archetypes for very complicated archetypes. So Activemq does, they might use Spring, Hibernate, and Struts together, or they might do Spring, Hibernate, and Tapestry. So for each one of the combinations that Matt has in Activemq, he's going to create an archetype for it. So it'll be a fully functioning application with a Maven build that will get spit out from an archetype. So generally that will hopefully save people a few hours of effort trying to download the bits and pieces and trying to get it work. You will actually have a fully functioning Spring, Struts, Hibernate application. One little example I do, let me try and use the Jetty. So this generates a very simple war project. And the Jetty plugin uses all the standard locations for a web app. Very basic web app, web XML, Index. So to get someone up and running with a little web app, and then if you use the Jetty plugin, the Jetty plugin will look at your compile any sources you have, compile any JSPs you have, and by default it will check every 10 seconds. So that took a Maven web archetype, and you start up the Jetty plugin, and you can immediately start playing around with your is very simple. It's a little hello world, little sample application. But so if you create your own archetypes for creating web apps, you can essentially spit out the archetype, start the Jetty run plugin, and you can start modifying it, edit your JSPs, and the Jetty plugin will reload them. You can just keep working. That's generally now how we work on all the interfaces for the repository manager, Continuum. And I'm offline here, so I'm not sure if the site will generate. I'm not sure if I have the plugin, but let me try and generate the site from the archetype here. It worked. So there's a little, just from the archetype, very small. So there was the act format document that we had, the little FAQ example. Xdoc, if people are familiar with Maven 1 or the Jakarta standard for doing documentation. So that's an archetype where someone can see how Maven works. It built, spit out a stub site and generates documentation like this. So that's you can get people up and running pretty fast, and from the archetype, really to get a basic site doesn't really take any work. Spitting out the archetype and running the site plugin. And I'll show. Does anybody use Continuum? Yeah. Okay. I'll do a little. Checking out a sample project. So this is a freshly checked out copy of Continuum. So it takes us, you basically just unpack the tarball. When it starts up for the first time, we had a problem with JPOX with Derby. So it takes quite a bit of time for it to set up the databases at first. But still, there's, as I'll show you in a second, there's not really much configuration. Continuum was essentially designed to work specifically with Maven 2. You can build, you can run shell scripts, or you can look at Maven 1 POMs or run Ant build files. But it was essentially made to take the information that's in the POM, the SEM information, your continuous integration information, and use it directly. So in the demo, I'll show that if you point Continuum at a POM, you can essentially pull in everything that you need. And if you're fine with the defaults in Continuum, you can actually have your project up and running in less than 10 seconds with Continuum. I'm not sure how many people have tried to set up cruise control. It works great once you get it set up. But anybody had any experience trying to set up cruise control? Yeah? And how long did it take you? About an hour?
More than that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great once you get it set up. It works fine. But trying to get it set up, or something like Anthill or Lund build, actually Lund build is pretty easy to set up, to be honest. But trying to get it to work with Maven projects, I don't think there's anything. I'm sure there soon will be, but essentially you have all the information you need to do continuous integration inside of POM. So while that's building, let me try and find I'll use Maven POM for example. Yes, I use a Mac, but I still use Maven Midnight Commander. I don't know if anybody's ever used it, but perfect without it. So we have the SEM information here in the POM. So that information is used by Continuum. And then the other piece of information. Okay, so Continuum is started here. So that's a brand new fresh copy. Do you have a question there? Or somebody put up a hand? Okay, sure. So that's Continuum coming up for the first time. And password. You can set the defaults, you don't need anything else in it. So that's Continuum now configured, and you log back in as the admin. And now we want to build a Maven 2 project, but I'm working offline and locally. And by default, Maven will not let you put in a file URL for security reasons. So we actually have to. 1.1, this is actually done with an admin console. This is Continuum version 103. 1.1 actually has an admin console, but for 103, you actually have to allow file URLs. Start it back up. Take our little sample application, take that POM, so I'm putting in the top level POM here of this project, which has several modules. So the modules here you can see. So Continuum also takes that information into consideration. So it walks through all the modules and it just added all the modules to Continuum. So every one of those projects that was listed in the POM is thrown into Continuum, and by default it will build hourly, so once they're checked in, if you wait for an hour they'll start building, but we can start building them all. So Continuum is checking everything out, and then configure the email address for the mail server, so that's following. But it's easy enough to set up your email addresses. So you see they're starting to build now, and you can see the results of, let's see what's built so far. So you can see with all the defaults, it just runs it in batch mode and builds your projects for you. So you can see they're all starting to build now. So as long as you populate your POM with the correct information, all your SCM information and all the information about your continuous integration system, doesn't matter how big your project is or how many modules you have, it can be that easy. Like that demo, I unpacked the stock version of Continuum, set it up, and just pulled it in a POM. I've obviously prepared the projects that I'm using. They have the correct information in the POM, but once you do that, it can take 5 minutes to get your project set up and up and running and having them build and continue.
If there are errors in the project, do you get emails? Do you get
there's
email?
So Continuum. So it's essentially a set of builders. So it has Maven 1, Maven 2, Ant, and shell script builders. Build triggers. So the default one is an alarm that goes off every hour. There are also SOAP and XML RPC interfaces. So if you want to add post-commit hooks to your SVN system or CBS, you can write a little Python or Ruby script that uses XML RPC to ping Continuum to actually do a build for you. And the notifiers are pluggable as well. So mail is standard. We have ones for most of the IAM systems, and Maven, we use the IRC one, so it just pops into the IRC room and tells us that something's not working. So all of those, that structure is fairly pluggable. The Geronimo developers have made a distributed version of Continuum using Activemq. So I just checked in a version to Continuum's trunk. First version of it doesn't have a UI, but the Geronimo developers actually use it every day to run Geronimo against the J2E TCK. So it's essentially a master machine that pushes out build requests to a bunch of nodes, and then the requests come back. So that's something that will be released in 1.2. 1.1 is actually, should be out this week actually. 1.2 is probably about 3 months away, and that version will have the distributed capability. In 1.1, a lot of the things people asked for, if you have a huge, if you're building a huge set of projects, in Continuum 1.1 we have project grouping, so that on the front page the project groups will come up and you can click to a group of projects. Like by default, the projects will be grouped by their group ID. So instead of getting one big huge page of projects, they'll all be separated by their group ID. We have an option now to kill a build, so which was a result of Activemq tests running amok. So we have a button now to kill all the processes and threads associated with the build. And we've added a security system in 1.1. That's based on RBAC, standard role-based access control.
So what kind of server load would you recommend? Could you set up a machine, a developer machine in the office?
Oh yeah, sure.
And just have it run?
Yeah. It's really a function of what kind of testing you're doing. So
yeah.
We have a server that doesn't really do much of anything else. If you're just doing builds to make sure the builds are working correctly, a standard machine or even some on a spare machine is usually fine. If you're running integration tests, or if you're a lot of times things like the check style test or generating the Java docs or coverage, they're fairly intensive, and we have a special profile for running those tests for Maven. And that machine is a dedicated machine because it runs those things all the time, and the generating the reports, especially the coverage and check style, can consume a lot of resources. So if you're just trying to do straight running unit tests and builds, a normal machine is fine. If you're running integration tests or generating massive quantities of documentation, it can drag the machine down quite a bit.
With the distributed build that's coming up, would that cover that sort of thing where you'd have the compute-intensive builds being sent to a particular destination?
Yeah, that's what the J2E TCK Geronimo splits everything up, and it's 12 machines that it's building across. On a single machine, it takes about 3 days to run. So they split it up between 12 machines. Yeah, and it's a lot easier. They've broken it up into parts. As if something goes wrong, then you pretty much have to start them over again. So.
Are there any other use cases other than TCK that you're aware of where that would be useful for?
Yeah, definitely. For a lot of the clients I've had want to either have these nodes running on machines with different platforms or different JVMs or different databases. So a lot of times they want machines to, they might have a matrix of things they want to test, whether they be platforms, databases, JDKs, and usually one machine won't do. You could probably do it with VMware or Zen or something, but generally they have a small cluster of machines that they build everything against. So mostly for different platforms and that sort of use case. Are there any other questions? That's pretty much the end of the demo and the end of the presentation. Anybody have any other specific questions about Maven or any of the other? Sure.
This is just kind of a best practice question. I believe I read in Better Builds that if you have a war artifact that has a dependency on another war artifact,
yes.
The default behavior is that it will do an item by item copy of files from one project to another, except where you've explicitly overridden or added. To me, that suggests a sort of pattern where if you have a white label product, packaged as a WAR file, you could have sort of different client versions just overloading what you have to do, and therefore getting away from branching it in Subversion or something. Is that the intention, or is it just a side effect?
Do you have a case where you actually need a WAR file you're making ones for different clients?
Yes.
And are you using profiles for that?
No, this would be. I'm thinking particularly of sort of more. Say the look and feel was changing rather more than say a theme would allow you to do. You wanted to have slightly different JSP behaviour, possibly throw in, overload some of the Java code as well, with a separate Java file. Was that the intention, or what was the intention of that?
I actually haven't read that part of the book.
Okay.
Which chapter was it in? I wrote.
I don't know. Somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle to do with. I think it was actually doing the nesting of modules. Yeah, it just wasn't elaborated on. So
any sort of customization like that, I would always do in a profile.
Yeah.
So I have lots of builds that either have different chunks of everything. So basically, set up profiles for any of those things.
Okay.
And that's what I use to actually customize everything.
Okay.
Anything that's different, I would always recommend using a profile.
Okay.
There's a link on the cheat sheet. I think that's a DevX article. Someone's written a very good article about profiling. I forget the name of the article right now, but it's like how to customize builds. So it's probably a DevX article, and it'll probably be that one link that points you to the right direction.
Any question?
Do you have a timeline for the IntelliJ plugin?
Pardon me?
Do you have a timeline for when the IntelliJ plugin is going to be the idea plugin?
The guy who's going to write it probably can't start until December.
So
Oh dear.
not until sometime after.
But he's probably, the guy who's writing the Eclipse plugin is probably the best Eclipse developer outside the Eclipse team. Actually, probably knows more than a lot of the Eclipse developers. And the guy that I have doing the IntelliJ stuff is probably one of the, the IntelliJ would like him to work there, but he can't from his current position. But he can't, he's working on 3 other products, and he can't start until December, but I imagine he'll finish it faster than anybody else. So he thinks that for Maven and better integration, sort of some simple POM editing, configuring the lifecycle and running that, it might take him about 8 weeks to get that working. So we're realistically probably looking at the end of January, like mid-February before he's actually done. He just can't start working on it. And I started it, but I just don't have time. Yeah, it's realistically probably in January sometime.
What's the story with the Eclipse plugin?
It is Eugene works on it constantly, so he's the one person who is being paid to actually work on Ide Integration. So it's at 0.9, the next version that will come out probably about a month from now. It depends on, I have to finish some stuff in the Maven better, which is used in all the IDEs. But it's from the people that I asked traveling around Europe, it's quite functional. It's working fairly well. It'll pull down Java sources and Java docs now, so that's all integrated. It uses the index that's generated by the repository manager, so that you can actually click on artifacts that are available in the repository, and it edits your POM for you and downloads them for you. So the integration is fairly good, and people have said that it's working fairly well. I've seen people using it. I only do basic things with it myself, but yeah, about 4 weeks for the 1.0 of it to come out.
2 questions.
Sure.
The next version of Maven 2.05.
2.05.
Any
When's that coming out?
Yep.
Conservative estimate, maybe 8 weeks.
8 weeks. Okay.
2.1 is going to take a while. There's so many. There are something on the order of 500 issues to fix. Which ones we'll pick and do first for 2.1 is still up for debate. There's a page in the wiki where we have a design queue of the things we're working on. So if you actually Google for Maven Design Queue, you'll actually see the issues that we're working on right now for 2.1.
All right, and that's going to come with a list of plugins, or is that going to be, or the plugins still separate from
Plugins are totally separate.
Yeah.
We'll have additions for the plugin API, but there will be no changes, so it'll all be fully backwards compatible.
All right. The next question is probably more useful for me working in work, is the WebSphere. You mentioned in a WebSphere tonight, a plugin is that coming out?
I committed a tool today that actually will help you convert WebSphere. It's not for WebSphere specifically, but it can convert WebSphere projects. Like WebSphere builds and flip it over to a Maven 2 build.
Yeah.
There is a WebSphere plugin at the Mojo project.
It's version 5, not version 6, I see.
Yes, I don't. About 3 days ago was the first time I've used WebSphere in 5 years, so I converted builds and I refused to install it on my machine, so someone else is actually.
Right.
Well, I can't install it, I don't think, on OS 10. Sorry.
When would you tend to use the Cargo plugin?
I've not used it myself because I use the Jetty plugin all the time for doing my WAR files. But
is it intended as similar kind of thing? Just
yeah, but it's abstracted for every type of container. So I think it supports it supports the open source containers. I think it has connectors for Geronimo and JBoss. I don't believe it has a WebSphere connector yet. But basically, it's just generally for starting and stopping and deploying stuff to containers in a general way. So when all the things are implemented in Cargo, there are some things that aren't, then that is probably the tool that will recommend people using it. It's quite good. It's just there's some containers that aren't supported, and that project might actually move over to Maven itself. I've talked to Vincent about it. And he's thinking he might bring it over to Apache.
It's basically local developer.
Yeah.
Work. Yeah.
Just getting back to your considerations of 2.1, are you in a position now to sort of summarise what the big picture is on 2.1? What issues are most probably going to get addressed the most, like more new features, like specific features, or solidifying and simplifying the 2.04/2.05?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't come from the start, so you might have covered that.
That's right. For 2.1, we're trying to add, one of the biggest things is trying to fix the dependency resolution mechanism. Unfortunately, when it was written, many of us were busy, so Brett did the lion's share of the work, and it works fairly well for the most part, but we still have some inconsistencies with downloads and having to do things repeatedly over and over again. So Maven Artifact, the underlying mechanism that actually does all the downloads, will probably be refactored heavily, rewritten. Internally, the way the project is built, we have a lot of bugs with the way inheritance, profiles, and interpolation work. So those mechanisms will probably be heavily refactored or rewritten. In the plugin manager as well. So those are probably the underlying technical changes that will probably allow us to do some of these things. So we're going to have tags and categorization. So now that we can actually index everything in the repository, we want to make some standard categories so that the repository manager has some pages for browsing, but we want to be able to group all database tools or all testing tools and things like that. So we're going to add categories to the POM, so you can actually.
Does that mean, like, when you publish something to a repository, that you write into, say, an index first before that actually gets written to the specific directory in the repository?
No, the repository manager. It's two separate things. We deploy stuff to the central repository, and then the repository manager, Archiva, actually then indexes the whole repository. It's not part of the deployment process in Maven. They're entirely separate. Specification dependencies. So instead of actually specifying a version of Java Mail, now there's a couple versions of it, like spec jars like that. You'll be able to do that in a more abstract way. So you'll say which that you want to use it. and Maven will just go grab the default version of it. For a lot of the specification jars now, we can either get them from Glassfish or Geronimo. Custom components. One of the lessons we learned from some client work and some of the work that David Blevins did for the distributed version of Continuum. Maven and Continuum use the same component model in IOC container. But people trying to create their own, when we had to create a dependency resolver using the RPM database, it's not so easy to do. Obviously, we can work around it because we know how Maven works. But for someone who is trying to replace some of the key components because they have to in their organization, being able to easily add a new component to Maven, that's something that we're trying to do for 2.1. Some dependency extensions. One of the things that came about from trying to use POMs that came from projects like Spring or Hibernate, they weren't constructing their POMs correctly, so they would actually include everything in the POM. So they would have every database driver, every MVC framework, so it was really hard to actually get those to work. And what people have asked for, we try to encourage POMs to be done correctly, but for projects that don't build with Maven, it's just too hard. So we've added an exclude all. So basically, if you had something like the Spring POM, you could basically just say exclude everything, which would just cut off the dependency graph, and then you'd add back what you wanted.
Yeah.
So another underlying thing is the sustained connections. Wagon, the tool we use for doing all our transfers, oftentimes for downloading large projects or doing releases, we're constantly opening new connections. So at least for the HTTP stuff, we're going to start using pipelining and try and pull everything in on one connection. Better parent versioning for people who have really large multi-module builds. You can inherit the group ID and versions and everything from the parents, but the parent POM, you still need to specify a version. So when you're doing releases, it can be very tedious to change the parent version for 100 modules. A lot of people have worked around it by making special plugins or using sednock scripts to flip them all, but it's not a very easy or consistent way of doing it. So that is a fix for 2.1. One of the things that I'm working on is the Maven embedder, which is for all the Ide integration. So a lot of the problems in the Maven core Maven itself are revealed when you actually try and run Maven in an embedded environment and run 5 copies of it at the same time. You find a lot of the problems very quickly. Java 5 annotations for plugins. We used QDocs long before Java 5 came along for annotating plugins, but people want to use Java 5. And we now have some of the other scripting languages working properly. So we have JRuby integrated. Ruby's integrated fairly well. Bean Shell has always been around, but and Python works as well. So people will be able to write plugins in scripting languages if they want. So those are the main features that we're working on. There's if you Google for Maven design documents, you'll find our page where we list everything.
Yeah, I've noticed that page it gives the impression that it's been written a fair while ago.
It has been written a fair while ago,
yeah,
but nothing's changed in terms of, we're still working on those 5 things that are in the queue.
Okay, so it's just perception that it is still actual.
Yeah, all I work on is 2.1 now.
Right.
How about backwards compatibility?
The plugins and everything in 2.1 is an addition, so everything should actually be fully backwards compatible. We're adding some APIs, and there are the POM. What we've done in the parser is actually relaxed it. So there are new elements that will be, the POM version will change for 2.1, but those will still work in 2.0. So we've actually, the parser will actually let elements that it doesn't understand through, so that you can actually still run builds using a new POM with new information. So a lot of people, one of the simple things would probably be to add categories so we can actually index it properly, but they won't want to move forward to 2.1 yet. So everything that I know of so far, and I know most of them, should be fully backwards compatible. The plugin API is the important thing, and it will be fully backwards compatible.
Has anyone started a Maven encyclopedia?
There is a fellow who has Eric Redmond. If you look for Maven Cookbook, he's actually started a site that has like little recipes for Maven.
Right. Because that, from the mailing list, there was a recent poll, and people were
it's the same
struggling.
guy. That guy
Yeah.
who did the poll actually wrote the
Yeah.
cookbook, and he's also the fellow who wrote the Demystifying the Palm, which is actually quite a lengthy article.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any kind of moving towards or integrating of any of the Maven proxies from the core app, or are you just guys saying, hey, that's their business, if they want to use our stuff, that's fine?
Archetype actually incorporates the Maven proxy code, so it's another project at Apache. It was originally called the Repository Manager. It's now called Archetype, and it is a tool for helping you manage repositories, and we've fully integrated the Maven proxy code into that tool. Ben Walding was a Maven 1 committer, and he made Maven proxy, so we've taken the code and pushed it back into the repository manager.
Is that going to be right through?
Yeah.
Right.
You can set it up to either, it'll actually have functionality to, well, it does now. It's running right now, and you can actually build it yourself if you want from the Apache repository. So it'll help you manage stuff. You can either download it and put it in a repository that you want to use, or you can use it as a facade. So you can have it call it Biblio or any of the other open source repositories or any other internal repositories. And it works exactly the way Maven proxy did.
Oh, right. So I get you that. So the Maven proxy source code on its own is old news because it's gone over to Archetype now.
Yes.
Right. See that? Oh, that's why it's so good.
So that code we sort of refactored it a little bit.
Yeah,
because
it's
fully integrated now.
Right, yeah.
What version is the repository?
Beta 1. Beta 1 is what we're approaching. So it's functioning now. We've actually been running it on the central repository for about a month.
How much grief would we get if we upgraded from Maven proxy to Archetype now?
I believe it uses Maven proxy configuration. We'll check that for you. I'm not sure if it has. I think we tried to actually allow you to use the original Maven proxy configuration. It's the exact same code, so we've either improved it. It actually, the two people have tried it and not had any problems with it, but I only know of two people who have tried it. So.
But it's out there and you can get it.
Yeah, you can get it.
What did you think of that? The proxy from Abstract Horizon?
I'm not sure.
Proximity.
Yeah, I've talked with him. I have not actually tried it myself, so I'm trying to get him to use Archetype, but I think he subsequently is in one of their commercial products, so I'm not sure if he will or not.
When I've been adding stuff to a Maven project, for instance reports and plugins, one of the major problems is finding out exactly what to do with the configuration. And basically just end up hunting through the user mailing list, Maven user list to find an example of somebody who's done it before.
Yep.
Is there any way you can extract the configuration that's necessary or that's possible from the plugin? And just make part of the report. Some of the reports do actually show configuration and what to do and a little example. But a lot of them are just completely blank.
Yeah, we have, for about the last month, we've had a plugin doc. We have a doc check plugin now. So in order for the plugin to be released, it has to meet some minimal standards. So it has to have a description page, it has to have a usage page, and it has to have a full configuration page. So we don't actually release the plugins now until they're actually past the doc check plugin. And we've had about 5 people working on plugin documentation for the last 6 weeks, so many of them have improved. If you follow the dev list, there's been constant reviews, or asking people to review the plugin documentation. So most of the plugins that will be released now with Mojo and the Mojo project and Apache have to pass this test. And with the repository running, I can actually extract a lot of the information. So a project that's not listed anywhere, but it's called Compendia. This is something that I'm trying to do to like extract all the documentation out of a project and actually aggregate it and index it with Lucene. So that's not going to come out anytime in the next week or two. But that will be, now that we do index the repository, it means that we know everything that's there. Like right now, it's pretty much impossible to know where Maven plugins are and where they all come from, because anybody can actually submit something to the repository and we have no idea where it came from. Or we didn't before, now with the repository manager we do. So that is one of the things that Compendia will try and do, is actually, say for example, find all the Maven plugins and give you a big aggregated list by category, where they are and what they do. And people who have released them, at least to the central repository, will be required to actually pass that doc check. So we're hoping that has started to improve the documentation for us anyway. Any plugin that's been released by us in the last 2 months has got documentation.
Okay, we've reached the end. Is there one final question?
Well, I have one more, but I've asked heaps, so...
It was fun. For every question you ask, we have 5 minutes.
Well, if you can stand up at the end, that's fine. Is there any... Would it be feasible at all to parcel up the bleeding edge development into tasks that could be handed off to people that are where there's a lot of legwork, say, but that it's not mission critical? Because I mean, I'm sure there must be a lot of people out there who've used Maven in anger, right?
Yeah.
And have thought, okay, well, I'll just go and have a look at that source, right, and try and fix that problem.
Yeah.
And the actual barrier to entry is still quite high, because you still got to bootstrap it, and then you've got to find your way around. Is that some kind of like feasible or tractable thing for 2.1, so that you can actually offload some work to the community?
As far as the core goes, there are 3 people in the recent past who, if they actually express interest and give me patches for the core, I'll usually spend an hour of the day and actually help them try and do something. The core right now is pretty much intractable unless you actually talk to one of the developers.
Yeah.
So anybody who is actually, people who submit patches with tests, usually they go in instantly, but most of the time they don't come with tests, and unfortunately they go stale. One of the things that we've done inside Apache, a lot of times inside Apache trying to make collaboration is often a problem, because people need to sign CLAs and legal agreements. But one thing we did about 2 weeks ago was to open a sandbox that's open to every Apache committer. So there's a lot of people who want to contribute to the core, but weren't part of the Maven project. So we've actually opened up a spot in SVN where they can actually work on branches, try and fix things, and they can merge from trunk a lot easier. They can actually write tests a lot easier, and we're hoping that will actually encourage people inside Apache at least to give us some more patches. Trying to incorporate people from the outside. We do have a special issue identifier as to what level it is, so that people can actually see an issue and see that it's sort of intermediate, sort of novice, and a lot of people try and pick off those tasks, like low-hanging fruit, to do it. It's a real problem, like people who want to get involved, it's difficult to determine. For the few people who have actually given me patches for the core with tests, I usually will do everything I can to try and get them involved. But I've spent a lot of time helping people on patches that they needed for something that they needed fixed. I helped them and then they disappeared. So, and that's fine. I mean, I don't mind helping people like that. But it can be, there's only so much time you have for actually, spending. I probably spend 10 hours a week with people who are trying to contribute things on the various, whether it be Wagon or SCM or Plexus or Maven itself. So in terms of making it easier, I think the fundamental thing that we have to do is actually document the architecture. I think that will be the greatest thing to facilitate people actually working on the core. And as of yet, there is not really much information. A lot of people who come into IRC and ask, usually one of the Maven developers will try and help someone. You know, one guy, for example, patched the lifecycle so that it would work to build OSGI plugins the other day. So we explained a couple things to him. He came back the next day and he had the lifecycle patched and tested. So I'll probably integrate that stuff this week. So one, the core has to be documented, and it's just generally a problem the whole time I've been at Apache trying to get people who want to contribute. They either jump in and figure it out, and I spend as much time as I can with people, but I think it boils down to having the architecture documented, which we haven't done, so that's our fault.
I suppose it's a dilemma as well from the outside, because you've got to actually make the effort yourself, right?
Yeah.
And it's got to come, and you can say, right, okay, well, how do I know that, you know, what's the probability that, you know, I'm actually going to get any response at all? And this has nothing to do with Maven. This is like, this could be your opinion from some other project that you submitted a patch to, and they've just like ignored you or whatever.
Yeah, I find that
it's a dilemma.
Yeah. Well, patches that come in with tests, I have filters for them in Jira, and those are the first ones I pick off.
Right. Okay.
If you submitted something with a test, I will, and it works, I usually take it.
Okay.
So, but a lot of people usually submit patches for fixes they need that isn't really tested for anything else, and I spend time applying it and find that they haven't even run the integration tests, and it busts 10 other things. So, unless they come in and talk and tell me that they've actually tried it in IRC, I will try the patch, but one of the things we'd like to automate is, you know, having something like Continuum, being able to take a patch from Jira, push it out into like a test branch, and basically test the viability of the patches. But I'm willing to bet probably only 20% of them would actually be viable. So I've spent a lot of time looking at patches, and I've wasted a lot of time trying to actually get people involved. And, you know, it's a trade-off. How much time, you know, we probably lose 10 to 20 hours, man-hours a week of people who contribute stuff, but we have no way to identify what's good and what's not if it doesn't come with a test. So,
fair enough.
Okay, that's it. I'd like to thank Jason, and I hope you can all show your appreciation. So